office hours. Today we're going to look at how changes in demand and supply can influence the amount of consumer and producer surplus that's created in society. Let's begin by looking at how an increase in demand would affect the amount of consumer and producer surplus. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift the demand curve out from D1 to D2. In doing so, you can see right here that we would move from this first equilibrium E1, where the price is P1 and the quantity is Q1, to a new equilibrium here called E2. This will result in a higher price, and it will also result in a greater amount of production. The question is, how does that influence consumer and producer surplus? And to think about that question, what we have to do is we have to highlight the areas of consumer and producer surplus and see whether they've grown in size or shrunk. So the original area of consumer surplus is always the area below the demand curve and above the price. So I'm just going to fill in the original area of consumer surplus right there. The original area of producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So I'm going to fill in that area down here. So this is our reference point, which exists when we were at the original equilibrium, and we've got the two areas of surplus captured there in green and in pink. Now we're at a new equilibrium point, and we use the same process to find the consumer and producer surplus, so I want to highlight that for you. And what we'll do is we'll look and see how these areas have changed in size. So the consumer surplus here would be, again, the area below the demand curve, but this time above the new price, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. A lot of this is new, and some of it overlaps. There's our new area of consumer surplus. First thing you should be able to see is that the new triangle here is bigger than the old triangle, so consumer surplus has expanded. The other thing we want to do is look at the producer surplus. So here's the new price, here's the existing supply curve, and the area of producer surplus would now be the area in blue. And the area of blue here was bigger than the area in pink down here, so producer surplus expands. Why should that make sense to you? Well, think of it this way. If there's more demand for goods, then consumers will want to buy more. We can see that right here in the movement from Q1 to Q2. So consumers benefit from the fact that they enjoy the good more than before. And producers also benefit because producers are now able to sell more than before, and so therefore the area of producer surplus expands. So in this particular case, since consumer and producer surplus expands, society is made better off by the introduction of additional demand for a particular good. Now let's switch gears and think about what happens with the supply curve if it shifts, but this time we're going to shift the supply curve in. So we'll go ahead and do that. It's going to generate a new equilibrium here, D2, at a higher price, P2, but at a lower output, Q2. We want to think about the difference between the consumer and producer surplus, so let's highlight the original areas again. Consumer surplus at E1 on the first supply curve would be the area below the demand curve and above the original price. So there's your original area of consumer surplus. And producer surplus is the area below the original price and above the original supply curve. So in this case, producer surplus is right down here. That's going to be our benchmark, and now we're going to see what happens when the supply curve again shifts back and what it does to the area of consumer surplus. So now, at E2, with less supply, the new price is P2. What do consumers get? They get the area below the demand curve and above the new price. So I'm going to highlight this here in yellow. And the new area of consumer surplus, which is the yellow area here, is smaller than the original green area. So what we have is consumers are worse off. And then we want to ask the question, well, what happens to producers? Producers get everything below price P2 and above the new supply curve. And so producers in this case get the blue area, and our blue triangle here, which you can see, is less than the original pink triangle. And that should make sense to you, because the whole idea here is that we're trying to measure the gains from trade. Consumer surplus is essentially how happy are we making consumers compared to the price that they have to pay. And if they're willing to pay more than the price, they get to keep the difference. That's the consumer surplus. And the same is true with producers. Producers have a cost of production and a willingness to sell the good, and they get to receive the market price. So in this case, the amount that they're actually able to sell has gone down. So this has reduced the amount of producer surplus. And at the same time, since fewer consumers buy the good, in part because the price is higher, what happens here is that the area of consumer surplus has shrunk. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'll see you again soon here at Office Hours.